She thought she was inheriting nothing more than an old ranch high in the mountains. But when she unlocked the hangar, she found something her grandparents had hidden for over 60 years. A discovery that would make her question everything she knew about them and about herself. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. The letter came on a Tuesday morning, folded twice inside a pale yellow envelope with the name of a law firm printed neatly in the corner. Kendra Wood had not expected anything more exciting that week than another round of emails from the company that had recently laid her off, reminding her to complete one last security form. But this envelope-heavy paper, her name typed on an old-fashioned typewriter, carried a quiet weight. The name of the firm, Reed, Palmer and Associates, sounded vaguely familiar, though she could not place it. When she tore the seal and read the first line, she understood why. It was the firm that had handled her grandparents' affairs. Her grandmother had died years ago. Her grandfather, Arthur Wood, had passed before Kendra was even born. Yet the letter claimed there was still an estate in her name, an old mountain farm that now legally belonged to her. At first she laughed. A farm? It felt absurd. She was an engineer, not a farmer, and her life for the last 20 years had been defined by office walls, quiet apartments, and the hum of machines. She had spent the last decade designing systems that were supposed to make air travel safer, faster, cleaner, though she had not touched a plane herself in years. And now, someone expected her to care about a forgotten property buried somewhere in the mountains of Colorado. Still, she read the letter twice, then 3 times. The description was oddly specific. High pasture, 1 main house, 3 auxiliary structures, approximately 15 acres of mixed grazing land. The place even had a name, the Ridge Hollow Farm, and an altitude listed 6,800 feet above sea level. The document ended with a single sentence that made her pause longer than she expected. To be transferred to the sole surviving descendant of Arthur and Louise Wood, to whom the open sky may again belong. That line stuck with her. She didn't know who had written it, probably some poetic lawyer, or perhaps her grandmother herself decades ago. But something in it tugged at the same quiet part of her that had been asleep since she left her job. She spent that night searching the address online, though the coordinates only led to a gray-green blur on a map. No photos, no listings. It was, as far as the internet was concerned, invisible. 2 days later, she was driving west. The idea came suddenly and stayed stubborn. She told no one, not even her son, who lived 3 states away and rarely called. The road out of Denver rose quickly, winding through the foothills that thickened into mountains. By noon, the peaks grew close enough to fill the sky, and by mid-afternoon, the asphalt gave way to gravel. She rolled down her window and smelled pine and dust. The higher she climbed, the thinner the air became, carrying a chill that slipped into the car through the cracks of the windows. The GPS signal vanished entirely. For the last 20 miles, there was nothing but switchbacks, narrow passes, and the occasional hawk circling overhead. At a small service station nestled beside a canyon, she stopped for gas. The attendant, an old man in denim overalls, watched her license plate as he filled the tank. "You're not from around here," he said, and his voice had that drawl born of long years spent without hurry. She shook her head, explaining she was visiting her grandparents' old place. "The Woods Farm," he muttered, as if tasting a memory. "Haven't heard that name in a while. That's up the ridge. You'll need 4-wheel drive before the second bend." The last part of the road. Well, it's more a suggestion than a road. He leaned closer, squinting. "You mind me saying, miss, the old man Arthur, he wasn't like the rest of us, kept to himself. They say he built something up there, something he never finished. You'll see what I mean." She thanked him, though his words stayed in her mind long after the station vanished in her rearview mirror. By the time she reached the ridge, the light was fading. The air was sharper, the wind unbroken. The first glimpse of the farm was almost accidental. A small valley nestled between two granite slopes, a house crouched at its center like a forgotten relic. The place was both lonely and magnificent, the kind of landscape that swallowed sound. Kendra parked in front of the gate, stepped out, and stood in the silence. The wooden fence was gray with age. The grass had turned gold and brittle, whispering as it moved. Somewhere far off, a raven called, its cry echoing off the cliffs. The smell of old hay drifted from the barn, mingling with something faintly metallic she couldn't identify. Inside the house, time had folded itself neatly. Dust covered every surface, but the furniture was intact, the curtains yellowed, but still hanging. A clock above the fireplace had stopped at exactly midnight. She touched the pendulum and watched it sway weakly, as if it wanted to move, but lacked the will. On the mantel was a framed photo, her grandparents standing side by side, their hands clasped, both squinting toward the camera as if into bright sunlight. Behind them, something glinted, metallic, blurred, almost out of focus. For a moment, she thought it might have been a piece of machinery, but when she looked closer, she saw only a streak of reflected light, like the shimmer of an airplane wing. She spent that night in the small bedroom upstairs, wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Sleep came fitfully. The house creaked in the wind. The rafters moaned. At one point, she thought she heard a low hum, soft, rhythmic, and strangely mechanical. It came from somewhere beyond the walls, distant, yet insistent, like an engine buried beneath earth. When she opened the window, the sound vanished. Only the endless wind remained, whistling across the ridge. Morning came gray and cold. Kendra boiled instant coffee on the old gas stove and sat by the window. The view stretched endlessly. The golden slope of the pasture, the dark fringe of pine trees, the thin blue of the horizon. From here she could see three structures apart from the house: a small shed, a crumbling barn, and farther away, at the very edge of the property, a long, low building of metal that looked out of place among the wooden ones. Its roof glinted in the sun. Even from a distance, it looked sealed tight, the kind of structure built for something important or secret. After breakfast, she walked out to explore. The earth was hard underfoot, the grass crunching as she moved. She started with the barn. Inside were the usual relics of farm life: rusted tools, empty feed bins, the skeleton of an old tractor whose tires had disintegrated into ribbons. But under the smell of straw and decay lingered another scent: oil. Machine oil, faint but distinct. It didn't belong in a barn. Following it, she found a wooden door hidden behind stacked crates. The door led to a small passage that tunneled into the ground, cool and dark. She ducked inside and saw the stone foundation of the hill itself. Nothing more. Yet the smell was stronger here, sharp enough to sting. Something was beneath this place, or had been. She left the barn unsettled and turned toward the low metal building at the edge of the pasture. The closer she came, the stranger it looked. It was not a shed. Its walls were thick, built from heavy panels, the kind used for aircraft hangars or industrial storage. The door was secured with a chain that had fused to rust. A faint warning sign was still visible through the peeling paint. High voltage. Keep out. She crouched, running her fingers over the cold metal. The surface was pitted, but solid. No windows, no vents, nothing to suggest what it held. As she stood there, a gust of wind swept through the valley, whirling dust around her boots. Somewhere above, thunder rumbled faintly, though the sky was still clear. She turned back toward the house. On the ridge to her right, she noticed a figure watching from a distance, a man, perhaps a neighbor. But when she blinked, he was gone. That night, she lit a fire in the stove and searched through the drawers for anything useful. In a wooden box beneath the table, she found a small stack of letters, tied with string. Most were dated before she was born. The handwriting was her grandmother's, looping, elegant, firm. They were addressed to "My dearest Arthur," though most had never been sent. She read the first few lines of one and stopped. "You promised the sky would speak again. You said the engine would find its voice, and when it did, we'd know we were forgiven." The words made her throat tighten. She set the letter down, her pulse quickening. The old hum seemed to return, faint and steady, as if the house itself was breathing. Unable to stay inside, she stepped out onto the porch. The air was cold enough to sting her cheeks. The stars were fierce, close enough to touch. Down by the pasture, the metal building reflected a shard of moonlight. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw a shimmer near the door, a subtle movement, as if something behind it had shifted. The next morning, clouds rolled over the ridge. Mist hugged the ground, softening every outline. Kendra stood at the window, watching the pasture disappear into whiteness. She remembered the old man's words at the gas station. He built something up there, something he never finished. The phrase echoed as if it belonged to her now, as if her own life had been waiting for this mystery. She didn't know why she felt drawn to it, only that she did. The metal structure seemed to pull at her attention like gravity. When the fog finally lifted, she walked there again. The chain was brittle with rust, and the padlock looked as though it hadn't been touched in half a century. Her fingers hesitated on the cold metal. The sound of wind filled her ears, and somewhere far above, an eagle cried. She whispered to the air, though she didn't know whom she was addressing. "Grandpa, what did you build here?" Then, with a sudden resolve that startled even her, she tightened her grip on the lock and pulled. The metal groaned, and the old chain fell apart in her hands. The door creaked open an inch, enough to release a breath of air that smelled like oil and rain. The darkness inside was absolute, but within it, she thought she heard that same low hum, alive, patient, waiting. She didn't step inside. Not yet. She closed the door gently, her heart hammering, and stood for a long time, staring at the seam where light met shadow. The clouds above the ridge moved slowly, their undersides brushed with silver. Somewhere deep in the mountain, the air vibrated faintly, like the echo of a heartbeat too large for human ears. When she returned to the house, she could still feel it, through the soles of her feet, through the boards of the porch, through the quiet walls that had absorbed decades of silence, the hum of something sleeping beneath the mountain, something that, for reasons she could not yet name, seemed to know her. And as night came again, bringing another wind that howled across the pasture, Kendra lay awake, listening to the sound she could no longer convince herself was only the wind. Morning came gray and uneasy, the air thick with the smell of damp earth after a night of rain. Kendra woke early, though she had slept little, her mind still circling the sound that had come from the direction of the hangar. It was easier to believe it had been the wind, or an animal trapped inside, yet something about that vibration lingered in her bones. She drank her coffee by the window, watching mist drag itself along the ground, curling between the fence posts like thin smoke. The mountains around her were still wrapped in fog, and for a moment it felt as if the world beyond the ridge had ceased to exist. Only the house, the pasture, and that metal building at the far edge remained, waiting. She tried to distract herself with small tasks. Sweeping, checking the old pantry, but every movement seemed drawn back toward the same thought. She would have to see what was inside. She told herself it was only curiosity, that an engineer could not look at a sealed structure without wanting to understand it. Yet beneath that rationalization beat something less practical and instinct, that the answer to all her unease lay behind that heavy door. By noon, the clouds had broken. Sunlight spread across the field, touching the roofs of the barns with a pale gold. Kendra took the old toolbox she had found near the stove, filled it with whatever looked useful. Pliers, a wrench, a flashlight that barely worked, and started across the pasture. The ground squelched under her boots, the wet grass brushing her legs. As she approached the hangar, the smell of rust and oil grew sharper. The metal walls shimmered with heat, even though the air was cool. The door stood exactly as she had left it the day before, the chain dangling uselessly. The lock split in two. She felt a flicker of guilt at the sight, as though she had violated something sacred. The breeze that came from the gap between the doors was warm and dry, carrying a scent that made her heart tighten. Engine grease and old electricity, the air of machine rooms and factories she had long left behind. She gripped the edge of the door and pulled. It resisted at first, then gave way with a moan of hinges. Dust billowed outward. Inside, light slanted through holes in the roof, slicing the dark into narrow beams that glowed with floating particles. The air was still, almost reverent. Her first impression was of size. The building was larger than it had seemed from outside, long enough to hold something substantial. Beneath a tattered tarpaulin near the center stood a shape she could not immediately name. She stepped closer, her boots crunching on gravel and bits of glass. The outline became clearer. Sleek, narrow, unmistakably aerodynamic. Her breath caught. She reached for the tarp, hesitated, then pulled it away in one motion. The thing beneath it shone dully, silver gray, its surface mottled with age, but still intact. It was an aircraft, small enough to fit inside the hangar, but large enough to dwarf her, an experimental model, single seat, the kind of craft built not for war, but for testing limits. Its nose was sharp, the propeller perfectly balanced, wings slightly curved as if designed for high-altitude air. She ran her hand along the fuselage. The metal was smooth, cold despite the warmth of the day. Near the tail, scratched into the paint, were the letters A.W. 1961. Her fingers froze. Arthur Wood, her grandfather's initials. The year before, he disappeared from public life. Kendra stepped back, staring at the plane as though it might breathe. Questions collided inside her head. How had he built it here, so far from any supply line or airstrip? How had no one known? And why had her grandmother never spoken of it? The longer she looked, the more details emerged. A control panel visible through the glass canopy, gauges arranged with obsessive precision, switches labeled in handwriting rather than factory print. A small plaque riveted near the cockpit bore the word Sparrow. The name struck her with unexpected tenderness. Her grandfather had once called her Little Sparrow when she was a child. She remembered him teaching her to fold paper airplanes at the kitchen table, his rough hands careful not to tear the thin sheets. "If it catches the right current," he'd said, "it can fly farther than you think." She hadn't thought of that in decades. The interior of the hangar held other signs of deliberate care. On the workbench, tools were laid out in perfect order, untouched by time except for a film of dust. A notebook sat open beside them, its cover darkened with oil stains. She brushed it clean and saw her grandfather's handwriting, precise, angular, the script of an engineer. The first pages were filled with measurements, fuel ratios, calculations for lift and torque. The later entries were stranger, almost lyrical. They said the air belongs to the state, but the sky belongs to those who remember what it feels like to breathe it. Another line: if she rises once, even for a moment, the world will know it still can. The mixture of science and poetry unsettled her. This was not the pragmatic man her grandmother had described. She spent the rest of the afternoon exploring every corner of the hangar. In one crate, she found old radio parts, coils, and transistors that must have come from military surplus. In another, sealed metal canisters labeled fuel restricted use. The labels were faded, but legible. Whatever this machine was meant to be, it had never been a hobby project. The realization deepened the silence inside her. She could almost imagine the sound of her grandfather's boots crossing the floor, the clatter of tools, the smell of hot metal. At times she thought she heard it still. The faint click of something settling, a sigh of air, as if the structure remembered him too. As the sun began to set, light pooled at the far end of the hangar, bathing the plane in a soft orange glow. Kendra stood beside it, her palm resting on the metal skin, and felt an almost imperceptible vibration beneath her fingers. She told herself it was the echo of her own pulse, yet it seemed to come from within the machine. The thought that something dormant might still live in it frightened her more than she wanted to admit. She closed the notebook, tucked it under her arm, and left the hangar with slow steps. When she turned to lock the door, she realized there was no need. The place had already sealed itself in her mind. She could no longer imagine the farm without it. Back in the house, she spread the notebook on the kitchen table and read until her eyes blurred. There were entries written days apart, months apart, sometimes years. One mentioned an incident she recognized from history. April 12, 1959, Project Horizon terminated. They said the altitude made men hallucinate. I think they were afraid of what we saw up there. The handwriting grew uneven after that, as though he had written while trembling. Another passage described an accident, a crash that had killed 2 pilots. His tone shifted from grief to defiance. I couldn't leave it buried. She deserves the sky. The last page ended mid-sentence. Ink had bled across the paper, where a spill or a tear had smudged it. She traced the line with her thumb, imagining his hand freezing above the desk. That night, she dreamed she was standing in the pasture again, the hangar wide open, moonlight flooding its interior. The plane stood on the threshold, gleaming, its propeller spinning soundlessly. From somewhere behind her came her grandfather's voice, calm and certain. If she rises once, the world will remember how. Then the sound changed. The hum deepened until it became the same vibration she had felt earlier. She woke with her heart pounding and the taste of metal on her tongue. The next morning brought rain. The world outside blurred into shades of silver. Kendra spent hours sitting near the fire, reading through the notebook again, forcing herself to analyze rather than feel. If the plane was truly built for high altitude, it would need a special engine, a pressurized cabin, and reinforced wings. She saw traces of all those features in the design sketches, but it was the tone of the writing that haunted her more than the engineering. There was desperation in those equations, as if each number had been a prayer. She began to wonder if her grandfather had truly built the plane to fly, or to prove something to himself, to the government, or even to God. When the rain stopped, she walked outside, the ground slick beneath her boots. The air smelled of wet metal and pine. She hesitated at the edge of the pasture, then kept walking until she reached the barn. Inside, water dripped from the roof, striking the dirt floor with soft, steady beats. She looked at the old tractor, the rotting beams, the broken tools. Every corner of this place spoke of lives that had labored and ended, of time that had run out. Only the hangar seemed untouched by decay. She turned toward it and saw through the open gap in its doors a faint shimmer of light, as if a lamp had been left burning inside. She froze. There was no electricity here. She had checked the lines herself when she arrived. The house barely had power. Yet there it was, a weak glow that flickered and pulsed like the breath of a living thing. She stepped forward slowly, rainwater dripping from her sleeves. The air around the hangar was warmer than before. The smell of oil was stronger. She pushed the door wider, and the light faded, swallowed by the daylight. Inside, everything was exactly as she had left it. The plane sat silent, the tarp lying crumpled beside it, and yet she could swear that only moments ago it had been moving. Kendra stood in the doorway for a long time, listening. Wind whispered through the cracks in the roof. Somewhere deep in the mountains, thunder rolled again, low and distant. She felt the vibration travel through the ground into her feet, up her legs, into her chest. It mingled with the slow, rhythmic beating of her heart until she could not tell one from the other. She turned away, closing the door gently behind her, and whispered to the empty air, "What were you trying to show me, Grandpa?" Back inside the house, she opened one of the drawers of the old desk and found an envelope addressed in her grandmother's hand. For whoever returns. Inside were a few faded photographs. The first showed her grandfather standing beside the same plane, younger, his hand resting on its nose, a small smile on his face. Behind him, the mountains stretched out in endless gray ridges. The second photo was stranger, a view from above, clouds beneath, and the faint curve of the earth visible at the edges. It looked like it had been taken from high altitude, impossibly high for a small aircraft. On the back, in her grandmother's neat script, were 3 words. He made it. Kendra sat staring at the picture until the fire burned down to embers. Night fell quietly. The sky cleared, revealing stars sharp as needles. She stood by the window, the photo still in her hand. Somewhere outside, the wind stirred again, carrying that familiar undertone, a steady hum that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was no longer frightening. It was like a voice calling her name from a long distance. She closed the curtains and turned toward the darkness of the room, the photo pressed against her heart, and whispered, "I'll find out." Outside, the hangar waited, silent and patient, its walls glinting faintly under the starlight. The plane inside lay still, yet beneath its silver skin, something unseen shivered, as if remembering how to breathe. Rain returned the next morning, whispering against the windows and sliding down the glass in slow, silver threads. The sound filled every corner of the house, a soft rhythm that dulled the edges of thought. Kendra sat at the kitchen table with her grandfather's notebook open in front of her. The fire had burned low, casting a pale light over the scrawled pages. She had read them so many times that the words now seemed to shift when she blinked, as though new meaning waited between the lines. Outside, the pasture was drowned in mist, the hangar reduced to a faint outline beyond the trees. She felt its presence even when she couldn't see it, like something alive on the other side of a thin wall. She could not stay idle any longer. By midday, when the rain slowed to a drizzle, she put on her boots and went out. The ground clung to her soles, heavy with mud. The air smelled of iron. She reached the hangar, its metal walls beaded with moisture, and pulled the door open just enough to slip inside. The light that entered was dim and cold, yet the plane's surface caught it like a mirror. The silver skin glowed faintly beneath the shadows, and for a moment, she had the irrational impression that it had turned slightly since yesterday. Her rational mind dismissed it, but the thought left her pulse unsteady. She moved around the craft, her fingers tracing the seams and rivets. Every line was clean, purposeful. Whoever had built this machine had loved it. She remembered her grandfather's face from old photographs. Calm, stubborn, the eyes of a man who built things not because he could, but because he must. In the notebook, he had written about balance, weight, lift, but also about faith, as if the two belonged together. When metal forgets its maker, it becomes a grave. When it remembers, it becomes a heart. She whispered the words under her breath, uncertain whether they were his or something her mind had invented. By the far wall stood the workbench. She brushed dust from the scattered tools, examining each as if it might tell her what he had done here. The wrench teeth were still sharp. A pair of pliers had been set down mid-motion, frozen in a gesture of intent. Beside them, she found another notebook, smaller and bound in cracked leather. Inside were lists of coordinates, temperature readings, and fuel notes. And at the bottom of one page, in shaky ink, a line that made her skin prickle. The sky closed above us, but I will open it again. Kendra leaned against the bench, trying to steady her breathing. What had he meant by that? Had he truly flown this thing? And if he had, how had no one noticed? The more she read, the more the boundaries between logic and belief began to blur. The project's name, Horizon, appeared again and again, accompanied by references to military reports she had never heard of. The entries hinted at experiments done at high altitude, at physiological effects no one understood, at a mission that had ended abruptly with the words, "Classified terminated." She tried searching her memory for anything similar from her years in the aerospace world, but nothing fit. If this machine was part of that, then her grandfather had built something decades ahead of its time. Late that afternoon, the phone rang. She had nearly forgotten it existed. The landline, an old relic that hung beside the pantry door. The sound made her flinch. When she lifted the receiver, a man's voice greeted her, measured, polite, but with an edge of command. "Ms. Wood, my name is Charles Danner. I'm calling from the Department of Defense Archives. We were informed of your inheritance." His tone suggested he already knew more than he wanted her to. "There may be certain items on that property that are considered federal assets. We'd like to arrange a visit to verify the inventory." Kendra felt her throat tighten. "There's nothing here but an old farm," she said carefully. A pause followed, the kind that tests the silence for weakness. "I see. Still, we'll be in touch," the man replied, and the line clicked dead. She replaced the receiver slowly. The rain had stopped, but the wind outside had changed. It was no longer soft. Through the window, she saw that the clouds over the ridge had thinned, revealing a pale band of light. The hangar glinted faintly in the distance, like an eye-opening. For a moment, she imagined someone standing near it, watching. Then the figure dissolved into shadow. She told herself she was imagining things, that solitude and sleeplessness were making her paranoid. But when she went out the next morning, she found tire tracks near the fence fresh, pressed into the mud, leading toward the main road. She crouched to touch them. They were wide, military-grade, too large for any local vehicle. Inside the hangar, everything looked unchanged, yet the air felt heavier, charged with a quiet energies that raised the fine hairs on her arms. She spoke aloud without meaning to. "They were here, weren't they? Looking for you." The echo that came back sounded like a sigh. She moved toward the plane and placed her hand on the propeller. It was motionless and cold, yet beneath her palm she thought she felt a faint pulse. She drew back quickly, her heartbeat racing. It was absurd. Machines did not breathe. But her grandfather's words echoed again in her mind. Even metal remembers. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of research and restoration. Kendra began cleaning the aircraft systematically, cataloging parts, tracing the wiring. Her body worked while her mind tried to keep up. She scrubbed away decades of dust, polished the panels, reconnected cables that had come loose. Every evening she read another section of the notebooks, piecing together fragments of history. He had written of a flight that was never recorded, a test done above the limit, and something he had seen there, something he could not describe except to say it was alive. After that, his entries became more personal, filled with guilt and longing. Louise says the sky changed me. Maybe she's right. But once you've seen it breathe, how can you live with the silence of the ground? One night, as she worked under the dim glow of a lantern, a noise cut through the stillness, a soft click from the cockpit. She froze. The switch for the main panel had flipped halfway up. She stared, waiting for movement. The light flickered once, then steadied. The gauges trembled as if testing themselves. Slowly, she reached inside and touched one of the dials. It was warm. Panic and awe twisted together in her chest. She turned off the lantern, leaving the hangar in near darkness, and stood there, listening to the soft hum that rose from within the machine. It wasn't loud, more like the memory of sound, a vibration that carried through the floor into her bones. She didn't know how long she stood there before the noise faded again, leaving her breathless and shaking. Sleep became a shallow thing after that. Each night she thought she heard faint footsteps outside, though when she checked, there was only the wind. Once, she woke to the distant whine of an engine and saw lights moving along the ridge-white beams sweeping across the field. She crouched by the window, her heart hammering until the lights vanished. She knew, with a certainty that needed no proof, that they were looking for the plane, and she knew she could not let them take it. The next morning, the sun broke through for the first time in days. The air smelled clean, almost sweet. She returned to the hangar, determined to finish what her grandfather had begun. She found a small metal case under the workbench, containing tools, fuel additives, and a handwritten note folded neatly inside. The ink had faded, but she could still make out the words. If she wakes, guide her gently. The heart must learn to breathe again. Beneath the note was a key. She turned it in her fingers, understanding what it was for. The ignition. Her hand shook as she slid into the cockpit. The seat fit her perfectly, as if it had been made for her. The controls were familiar, yet alien, a blend of known engineering and something beyond it. She turned the key halfway, and the panel lights came alive. Amber, green, white. Needles quivered, then held steady. The hum returned, stronger now. The air in the hangar seemed to contract around her. She wanted to stop, to run, but another voice, quiet, almost tender, rose in her memory, her grandmother's words from that unsent letter. You promised the engine would find its voice, and when it did, we'd know we were forgiven. Kendra turned the key the rest of the way. The propeller twitched once, twice, then spun with a sudden burst of power. The sound filled the hangar, deep and resonant, not the mechanical roar she expected, but a living tone that seemed to harmonize with the wind itself. Dust lifted from the floor in spirals. She felt it vibrate through her chest, through every nerve. Lights flickered along the walls, casting the plane in a glow that made it look as though it were carved from lightning. For an instant, she saw movement in the reflection on the glass. Two figures standing beside the aircraft, hand in hand. Her breath caught. The faces were familiar. Her grandparents, young again, smiling as if they had been waiting for her. Then the light flared, too bright to see. The next thing she knew, the hangar was silent. The propeller had stopped. Smoke curled faintly from the exhaust. Kendra sat motionless, her hands gripping the controls, tears drying on her cheeks. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of memory, of completion. The plane stood as it had before, still and perfect. But now the air around it pulsed faintly, as if the heartbeat within had returned to rest. She climbed out slowly, her legs weak, and stepped into the sunlight streaming through the open door. The storm clouds had broken completely. The ridge lay clear and golden before her. Somewhere high above, a hawk circled, its cry echoing through the valley. That night, She dreamed again of flight not falling, but rising. The farm, the house, the hangar grew small beneath her, swallowed by mist, and the sky opened without end. She felt no fear, only peace. When she woke, the world outside was still, washed clean by rain. The hum had faded, but she could still feel it somewhere deep beneath the ground, a heartbeat that refused to die. She knew then what her grandfather had meant. The machine was not just a creation. It was a promise to keep reaching, to keep remembering that even metal can breathe if someone loves it enough. When Kendra woke, the air was so still, she thought at first that the world had stopped breathing. The room smelled of ash and rain, the faint aftertaste of a storm that had already passed. Her body ached, as though she had been running for miles, though she could remember no dream, only light white, blinding, endless light. She rose slowly, her movements heavy, and walked to the window. Outside, the valley shimmered in early dawn. The grass sparkled with dew. The hangar door stood open, a dark mouth against the brilliance. She felt a tremor of unease, a quiet knowing before her mind could name it. Something was missing from the air. The hum that had haunted her for days was gone. She dressed quickly, pulled on her boots, and stepped outside. The earth was damp beneath her feet, soft with new water. The wind carried a strange freshness, like the first breath after long illness. She crossed the field toward the hangar, each step drawing her nearer to a silence that was almost holy. When she reached the entrance, the sight froze her. The plane was gone. The floor where it had stood was scorched slightly, as if something powerful had lifted away. A trail of fine dust lay scattered in the shape of wings, silver in the morning light. Kendra knelt and touched it. The residue was cool, but it shimmered against her fingertips, leaving behind a faint metallic scent. She looked up, and through the open roof, saw a pale line cutting across the sky, a narrow, glowing scar that didn't fade. She remained there for a long time, unable to speak. The world hushed around her. Every sound seemed distant, the rustle of the wind, the drip of water from the roof. She whispered his name once, softly, as though to confirm what she already understood. Her grandfather had finished his flight. Whether the machine had risen by her hand or by his, she could not say. But something had departed, and in its leaving had changed the valley. She stepped out into the open pasture and looked around. The hills gleamed wet and green, brighter than before. Where the ground had been cracked and dry, small pools of water now mirrored the sky. It was as though the earth itself had inhaled. She followed the slope toward the creek bed, drawn by the sound of running water. When she reached it, she stopped in disbelief. A stream, clear and fast, flowed where only dust had been. It curved through the pasture, cutting a shining path toward the trees. She crouched, dipped her fingers into the current, and felt the cold bite of living water. The farm, for the first time since her arrival, felt awake. She glanced toward the ridge and saw mist curling from the rocks like breath. The air carried the scent of pine and ozone, sharp and new. The line in the sky was still there, stretching from one horizon to the other, a mark of something that refused to vanish. Later that morning, a car appeared on the road, a government vehicle, dark and sterile. Two men stepped out, both in suits that looked too clean for the dirt they stood on. Kendra watched them from the porch, the old notebook hidden under her arm. The taller of the two approached, removing his sunglasses. "Ms. Wood," he said, his tone measured but not unkind. "I'm Agent Danner. We spoke on the phone." His gaze drifted toward the hangar. "We'd like to take a look at the structure." She nodded, her voice steady despite the quickening of her pulse. "You're welcome to look," she said. "But there's nothing inside." He studied her for a moment. then signaled to his partner. They walked to the hangar, their footsteps muffled by wet grass. From where she stood, Kendra could see their silhouettes moving inside. One bent to inspect the floor, the other took photographs. When they returned, their faces betrayed nothing, but she caught a flicker of confusion in the younger man's eyes. "Did you move something out of there recently?" he asked. "We found burn patterns." She shook her head. "The last storm hit hard. Maybe lightning?" Danner looked at her for a long time, as if weighing the truth behind her calm. Finally, he gave a slow nod. "If anything unusual turns up, you'll let us know." "Of course," she said. They left a card on the porch before driving away, their tires leaving deep tracks that filled instantly with rainwater. When the sound of the engine faded, the silence returned, vast and patient. She walked back to the hangar once they were gone. The scent of oil and smoke lingered faintly, but the place no longer felt oppressive. The air was cool and sweet. She ran her hand along the doorway, remembering how terrified she had been to open it for the first time. Now it seemed a threshold not into danger, but into understanding. On the workbench lay one final thing she hadn't noticed before, a folded sheet of paper weighted down by a small wrench. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was her grandfather's, though faded almost to invisibility. "For whoever finds this," it read, "if she flies, it means you listened. The world forgets how to dream faster than it forgets how to destroy. Keep the sky open." Beneath the message was a simple drawing of a bird, its wings stretched wide. She sat on the bench, the note trembling in her hands. There was a peace in the words, a release she hadn't realized she'd been waiting for. The plane had never been meant as a secret weapon or a rebellion against science. It had been a confession, a way to give the sky back its voice. She thought of her grandmother's letters, of the loneliness that had filled this valley after Arthur vanished from the world. He hadn't built the Sparrow to defy gravity. He had built it to remember hope. And somehow, through her, it had found the air again. Days passed, and the valley continued to change. Grass spread where the soil had been bare. The creek grew louder. Birds returned to perch on the fence posts. She worked quietly, repairing what she could. The roof of the house, the broken fence, the old generator. There was satisfaction in the rhythm of it, in the way the farm responded to her hands. Sometimes, in the evenings, she would climb the ridge and sit where the view opened wide. The line in the sky was fading now, almost invisible in daylight, but at dusk it glowed faintly, a silver thread across the dark. She began to call it the trace, the last breath of the Sparrow. It comforted her to think that part of it still lingered. Once, when she returned from town for supplies, she found a group of children at the gate, pointing upward and laughing. One of them, a girl with red braids, ran to her and said, "Is that your plane up there? My dad says it's a weather balloon, but it moves funny." Kendra looked where the child pointed. High above, just barely visible, a glint of light hovered before sliding smoothly into cloud. She smiled. "Maybe it's just the sun playing tricks," she said. The girl frowned, unconvinced. It looked real. Kendra watched the spot until the last gleam disappeared. She knew better than to explain. That night, she sat on the porch with a lantern beside her and wrote the first page of what would become her book. The Ridge Hollow Journal, she titled it. The words came slowly at first, but once they began, they didn't stop. She wrote about her grandparents, about the strange engine that hummed beneath the earth, about how the valley had changed. She didn't describe the flight itself. Some truths belonged to silence, but she tried to capture the feeling of standing beneath that streak of light, knowing it had come from something human and impossible at once. Her goal was not to prove anything, only to remember, to make sure that when the world forgot again, Someone might still hear the echo. Seasons shifted quietly over the mountains. The winter snow melted early that year, and spring rose like a sigh from the thawing ground. Kendra planted a small garden near the porch, built a wooden sign that read, "Ridge Hollow Museum." Visitors began to come, locals first, curious about the stories, then strangers who had heard rumors of a woman living on a farm where the sky had once glowed. She welcomed them kindly, showing them the photographs, the notebooks, the letter her grandfather had left. No one asked directly about the plane, though a few lingered at the hangar door, gazing into the emptiness as if expecting to hear an engine stir. At night, after everyone left, she would lock up and sit by the creek, listening to the water and the faint, rhythmic pulse that still seemed to come from the ground. Years later, the place became something more than a farm or a memorial. It became a haven for those who felt the weight of silence in the modern world. Artists, engineers, dreamers. They came and stayed for a while, each leaving behind a piece of themselves. Kendra grew older among them, her hair silver, her hands still steady. The notebook of her grandfather she kept in a glass case, though she still opened it on quiet evenings, tracing the lines of ink with a reverence that never faded. The final page she had written herself in small, careful letters. He opened the sky. We only had to look up. One summer evening, long after the sun had set, she stood at the edge of the pasture. Fireflies drifted through the grass, their light trembling like tiny stars. The creek sang softly behind her. She tilted her head back and saw, far beyond the clouds, a point of light moving steadily west to east, brighter than any star. For a moment it flickered and was gone. Then came a faint sound, so low it might have been the wind, yet distinct, rhythmic, familiar. The hum of an engine that should no longer exist. It rolled across the valley, gentle and brief, before dissolving into stillness. Kendra smiled, tears filling her eyes. "Now you rest," she whispered. "You did it." The night deepened. The ridge lay dark except for the single silver line that crossed the heavens, faint but unbroken. She stood there until the chill reached her bones, and only when the stars began to fade did she turn back toward the house. The lantern in her hand cast a narrow circle of light over the path. In its glow, the wet grass sparkled, and for an instant as she walked, it seemed to her that the earth itself shimmered with the reflection of something vast, unseen, moving far above. And as she reached the porch, she stopped once more, looking toward the horizon, where dawn was beginning to touch the clouds. The first light of morning stretched across the ridge, spilling gold through the mist, and in it, the trace of the sky brightened once again, no longer a scar, but a promise. Kendra closed her eyes and let the warmth fall over her face, hearing in it the echo of the same heartbeat that had guided her from the start. The valley breathed, the mountain breathed, and above it all, unseen but eternal, the sparrow flew. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Watch our other stories for more true mysteries and unforgettable moments. And if this one moved you, share it with someone who still believes there's more to discover.